Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. This is the Sunday morning edition of the Joyful Friar. I rarely do an episode on a Sunday because I'm usually busy doing other things, and I will be, but I had an extraordinarily good night's sleep. You might know of me that I often get spirit visitors during the night. Even when I do, I usually fall right back to sleep, but no visitors last night and just a good night's sleep that had me up extra early and extra energized. So this is as good as it gets. So this morning, we're going into part two of our trilogy on Eric alone with his thoughts. I love the Eric story, love the person of Eric because he touches my heart. I've spent much of my career with college students. I live on the campus of the University of Arizona. I'll be around a lot of students throughout the day today because I'm preaching at all of the masses. Eric, if you recall from last episode in this series, died between graduating with an undergraduate degree and before choosing what to pursue next. He knew that he was going on for an advanced degree, probably a PhD, but he didn't want what he called a clumsy series of degrees where you move from university to university studying somebody else's curricula. He was looking for something that he said he wanted something seamless. He wanted to study everything, really. He wanted to study meaning and purpose, and he said, I didn't really want to be a philosopher. I wasn't a religious person. I admired the way religious people allowed for wonder. He was interested in the wonder of the universe, and he really wanted to explore all kinds of things. But he said, who would pay me to do that? He looked at over toward the tech industry because there's a lot of innovation has gone on in the tech field, especially during his brief lifetime here. But he said, what do they do when you get hired there? Do they make time machines or something? So he was a guy still looking for the path forward for what his like vocation would be, what his purpose and contribution would be. If you recall, he was on the day of his death exploring by joining a group of people he didn't know who were going on a hike. I think it was through an app, but I'm not sure. But it was some sort of uh, invitation that was broadly made for come one, come all. We're going to go on this hike. Join us if you want. And he did. But he was disappointed that rather than it being an opportunity to meet new people, it seemed like everyone except him had come with a partner. And they were all in pairs or clusters, and he was alone again. He read the situation, and he just decided that he would stay back, be the last one in line, and not really try to pair up that day. He also said, which is very practical knowledge, that a hiking trail isn't really a great place to hold a conversation. Trails often are one person at a time, and you're looking at the back of the head of the person in front of you. It can be hard to hike two abreast and hold a conversation while you're climbing over things. Anyway, he was used to being alone anyway. He was the only child of two PhD parents. And he even told us, do you remember, that when people got a little too close to him, he often backed off a bit. So he acknowledged, he had self-knowledge that I wasn't necessarily a person who was easily befriended. So anyway, that was kind of the state of things on the last day of his life here. If you recall, he was on this hike, but he was all the way at the back, and he took a step that created a rock slide. He slid, and the slide displaced enough ground that he ended up buried upside down, his feet sticking up out of the dirt. Realizing that he couldn't move his arms, he could hardly breathe. His death was quick. but he had a moment at least to say, oh, look what happened to me. I'm going to die right here. And he did. Today, this episode is compassionate response. So compassion means to suffer with. And I just believe it's part of a life well lived is to uh, be a companion to people when they're suffering, to try to ease their sufferings if you can. It's also, I think, a part of a life well lived to allow others into your space, even if it feels uncomfortable when you are in need of compassion. Sometimes when we're wounded, we want to push everybody away, and that can be detrimental, and it can be bad for the other person, because being able to exercise compassion, I think, is just an important spiritual muscle. So in my attempt to be with you in a compassionate response, I'm especially have in my heart today any of you who are watching this who are in a moment in your life where you're brokenhearted. I know that some people seek out the topic of near-death experiences and the kind of things that I write about in my book, in part because dealing with the grief of having someone they love die, and especially if they die young or abruptly where there was little advance notice, it can just be so hard. So I'm hoping that today I might have something that could ease your sufferings a bit or help you form a new thought that might be part of your healing. Compassionate response with Eric alone with his thoughts. That's what I called him. That's what he said about himself when he made that decision to stay back and be the last one in line. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset that this hike was misrepresented. He just read the situation, that's all. And when he looked at the situation dispassionately, he just decided, well, I'll just make a different choice. I will be alone with my thoughts. And as I mentioned, he was the only child of two professor parents. He was used to being alone a lot anyway. So that wasn't really a big stretch for him. He just thought, well, I'll enjoy my own company. Well, one of the things that I wanted to bring up that by way of compassionate response is sometimes when a person dies alone, there's a sense of alarm and deep brokenheartedness. Oh my God, my poor beloved, poor Eric, he died all alone. And it seems to us that death is frightening, and it would have been nice to have someone hold your hand or calm you, assure you of their love or something like that. Particularly during the pandemic, there were so many people who were dying in hospitals or nursing homes where loved ones who would have visited, who wouldn't have been at a bedside for a vigil, were not allowed to. And that was noted a lot in the media, that the grief that people were experiencing with deaths of loved ones during the pandemic were exaggerated because of the loneliness aspect to it. Well, here, listen up. My experience is that none of us die alone, ever, ever, ever. And that's borne out in the story that Eric tells us about what happened in his death. He was accompanied by his guardian, kind of helped up to his feet, brought to a place of safety. I've seen that over and over if you've read my books, but over and over again, the companionship of one's guardian angel, whatever you call it, spirit guide, I just stay with guardian angel. They always are there to make sure that you are safe, even while you might be dying in a circumstance that was anything but safe. They're there to remind you that you were always larger than your mortal life on earth. You were always larger than the mortal body that you knew would die of something someday. That day arrived, and here we are. Well, Eric had a particular gift, I think, for being in the present moment, which is a great skill. And he didn't die alone. Nobody does. my undergraduate degree was in gerontology, and at one point in my life, I spent a lot of time around elders, and some of those in healthcare settings, nursing homes. My mom lived in what she insisted on was an independent living apartment, and it was. But it had lots of services around it that enabled her to be independent. Very, into her 80s. She died at 91. I used to be around a lot of elders, and one of the griefs that can circulate among a group of elders is someone might go unseen for a day or two, someone who lived alone in their own apartment or their own home, and they're found dead, and they might have been dead for a day or two. And there can be a great grief around that, like, isn't that just so pathetic and awful? Well, except that nobody does die alone. I don't know how else to say it. Eric didn't die alone, even though he was at the back, and nobody in that hiking group realized what had happened to him. And then in the story that he told, who showed up for him? A group of medical school young men and women who died while they were in med school. Some of them were wearing university clothing, sweatshirts and stuff with university logos, and they were comparing notes about different kinds of treatments for head injuries and things because they were from different parts of the world. There was a cluster of people who, like Eric, died during their 20s, during their college years, and he was assisted by them right away. That brings me to another idea that can happen when a young person dies, especially suddenly. Oh my, what a waste. He died so young. All that potential now unrealized. He could have set the world on fire, whatever, and now he died young, and that's the end of it. Well, except if you accept the premise that we're eternal always, his potential wasn't wasted. It just didn't get actualized fully here. He told us that he hadn't yet decided on a program of study because he wanted something that was more comprehensive, and much of higher education is built with specificity in it, and that gets exaggerated as you go further along. I was at Stanford for a number of years, and that was the first time I really worked with a lot of PhD candidates. That process is so long, it's a number of years long, and part of the discernment near the front end of it is choosing a research topic for your dissertation, and then you have to create some sort of experiment and some sort of protocols to create a thesis and try to prove it. Then get your evidence together and write up your results before somebody else in the world who might have decided to do the same thing beats you to the punch. I discovered lots of PhD candidates that couldn't stand their topic anymore. They were so tired of it, who would have much rather enjoyed something that wasn't quite so specific. Anyway, I don't believe Eric's potential went unrealized. It's true that it went unrealized here on Earth, but this is not all there is. I believe Eric simply moved all that potential and all that enthusiasm for life to a next plane. I think the next plane, or planes, is better suited for his temperament anyway. He was looking for something that was more comprehensive, and I think he was able to find that. One part about Eric's life was that sometimes people can feel like if a person died before they could marry and have children, that, oh my, isn't that awful? I'm not married and I don't have children. Is that so awful? There are lots of ways to live a life, and none of us are guaranteed long life or a specific template for how it's all going to unfold. Eric told us about his relational life, that when people got a little too close to him, he pulled back anyway. He wasn't really ready for, he didn't like dating. He said, it looks so opaque to me. Why can't people just get together and hang out and have fun? And I think he did that, at least on a scale that suited him. But sometimes I think we can have in our mind that that somebody didn't get to do something that that we in our imagination think is essential to have had a happy life. I don't think Eric died an unhappy person. So if that's a part of any grieving that you might be doing, would you give that a second thought? There are lots of ways to live a life, and we don't need to necessarily think in terms of deprivation and the glass half empty when a young person dies, not if they keep living, and they do. So I don't think it was a waste that Eric died, although, you know, I only know him in the way that I do. If any of you are listening to this and happen to know Eric, and I'm treading upon your grief, I apologize. But the person I met, the Eric I met, was full of enthusiasm, which is interesting because he told us that he was not a religious person, and he didn't use religious categories to move through his death. The word enthusiasm means to have God inside, entheos in Greek. He was certainly enthusiastic. I saw that. He had a colossal, wonderful imagination. Imagination, imago means face. And both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, in whom I'm schooled, taught that nothing comes to be actually until it first exists in the imagination of its creator. Let me repeat that. It's not a complicated idea. Nothing can come to be actually until it first exists in the imagination of its creator or its maker. Think, for example, of something as simple as cooking. I live in a community where Tuesday nights is my night to cook, and I often do the Thanksgiving and Christmas meals because I enjoy putting on a big feast, and not doing it all myself, but at least apportioning out all the tasks that need to be done to create a communal, joyful experience of a meal. Even if it's a weeknight meal and something pretty simple, one of the guys that I live with is vegan, so I have to think of what am I going to do for my vegan. Some, have to do low salt or don't want onions or whatever. If you cook for anybody, there are always some likes and dislikes, allergies and such. You have to think ahead and then plan, several courses and think of how they will all turn out at the same time. That's one of the trickier things. You have to imagine things that delight the person who are going to enjoy your meal. How to make it attractive to the eye. I think that's a large part of entertaining, and I love to do that. All that is going on in my imagination, and I settle in on that's it. I'm going to do that meal. Then that means writing down an ingredients list, maybe going to a recipe, going grocery shopping to have all those things in mind, all these steps that need to be done to move toward the thing that you're trying to create. All that's happening in imagination before you even turn on a burner on the stove. Everything's like that. Everything that's created, the way that I was taught and that makes sense to me, is the entire created universe operates that way. That the mind of the creator, the mind of God, first imagined you before you came to be. And I remember being taught in first grade that God said somewhere in 1955 that the world is already a beautiful place, but wouldn't it be great if Nathan were in it? And then through the agency of my parents' love for each other, God's design of me begins to be actualized, and then he made me a co-creator, not just an object that rolled off an assembly line, but gave me the capacity to do what he did, to imagine and be a co-creator. I believe Eric wouldn't have used any of that religious language, but he understood himself to be a creative force in the universe. He just wasn't sure what he wanted to create or what the universe needed that he might be able to provide. Well, he he had enough imagination to know what he didn't want, and that's a large part of choosing a life path when you're a young person. I I found college to be such a candy store. Everywhere I looked, there was something that I wanted to study, and I chose a place that allowed me to be um, free to do that largely. And I had interdisciplinary degrees in sociology and social sciences, and I really did enjoy that undergraduate candy store. But then as I moved toward what am I going to do after that, I did have to get more specific and imagine what my future path might be. And I'm often asked, well, how did you choose to be a priest? And how did you choose to be a Dominican and all of that? Well, I imagined it. I looked around, I took in information, I mused over it, I prayed over it, I played out ideas in my mind, and eventually I began to study the steps that would be necessary to actualize something that was in my imagination. All right, well, that was a lot of words to introduce imagination, but I think when I think of Eric, when I imagine Eric, one of the characteristics that just stands out about him to me is that he was imaginative. In his afterlife, we were only, just casual players. My prayer partners and I are only helping him move from this kind of therapeutic level that is needed by some people when they die suddenly, abruptly, violently, and he had. But he knew that he was ready to move from that, and he knew that he was moving to something with a great deal more freedom and potential. Oftentimes at funerals, we'll hear people uh, speak hopefully about the deceased and say, now Jack is up there on the first tee in heaven. If Jack enjoyed golf, we're imagining that, or he's with his poker buddies, or mom is reunited with dad, or those kind of things, where we have a sense of what a person might have imagined their heaven being. Well, again, Eric wasn't going to use heaven as a category, but he knew that he had an incremental step to do. He needed to move from this level of what he was at, with the assistance of my prayer partners and myself, to a next thing that where a lot of potentials would open up. But he knew he needed a companion. He needed a guide. At the time, we had kind of three categories that we worked with often. I often would say, can you think of anybody who died before you did, who you know loved you? But that's the primary one that most people use. Essentially, luck of the draw. You could opt, if you like, to simply say to God, the universe, those around you already, I'll take whoever comes. I've had several people say to me, since I got here after my death, I've been nothing but well treated by everyone I've met. I'm confident that whoever shows up next, even if I've never met them, will be equally kind and competent to get me to the next place. I've seen that happen a number of times, where they're just happy to have anybody. And those anybody's often end up being somebody that they knew that they hadn't even thought of. It was their piano teacher that they hadn't seen in 40 years, or their scout leader, oftentimes childhood figures, somebody that they went to school with in elementary school. It could be just about anybody. And then there's this other category that in his presence, I glossed over pretty fast, which was celebrity. I've been told over and over again that in the afterlife, or in the kingdom of God, if you want to use religious language, and I do, that God loves all of us and that we're all well known. Nobody has to grab for headlines. Even the people who had fame here, they become aware that their fame was often regionalized or in a linguistic group. You might be a famous singer, but your songs are all in English, and so non-English listeners don't pay very much attention to you, even though you might take up a lot of air in the room whenever you're traveling. Anyway, and that time changes fame. Somebody that was quite famous decades or centuries ago hardly is known outside of the milieu where they were famous. Anyhow, I mentioned celebrity or famous people. Like, that question, if you could be on a desert island with anybody at all, who would it be? If it was just you could be one-on-one with somebody, just the two of you, who would it be? That's the direction Eric went in his imagination. He said, wait a second, did you just say it could be anybody? And my prayer partner said, well, we don't force anybody. We don't have the capacity to do that, and we wouldn't do it if we did. All we do is invite, and the person would have to be available and interested and desire to do it, but it wouldn't hurt to ask. And he said, well, then I want Einstein. And I remember my friend who was helping at the time, who was a campus minister, said, well, all righty then. All right, well, sit tight. And then we just said a little prayer. And we didn't make a big deal out of the prayer because, remember, Eric was not a religious person, so we didn't need to go into a lot of elaborate theological or spirit language. We just said, God, you know Eric's heart. Eric is asking this question: would it be possible for Albert Einstein to come for him and accompany him to his next level? We sat still for not more than 10 seconds. And then this time it was sort of visual, and it's 2 years ago now. I don't remember if it was Eric telling me what he was seeing. He was inside me. So sometimes we're more co-conscious. I see what the person inside me sees, but not always. Sometimes they see a thing and they say, look at that. And I have to say, well, tell me what you're seeing, because I don't see it. And then they describe it. The person who showed up for him was Einstein, but not he said, not that guy with the walrus mustache and the shocking gray hair going in every direction. Not that picture that you might have of Einstein in your head. He said, no, he's coming as this tweedy young professor, like early 30s, just starting out in his professorial career. He's showing me that because he wants me to know that I could be like younger brother to him. And he could be my older brother, like really, really smart older brother. Wasn't that beautiful? It Eric was an only child. He didn't go on about wishing that he could have had siblings, but it sounded to me like like God, the universe, knew that there was a place in Eric's heart for bonding with a sibling that he never had, and that Einstein presented himself as this really, really smart older brother. And he was a professor who had all the chops, I think Eric called it, in physics and math. But he said he also had a sense of mystery and wonder. It wasn't exactly religious, but it was what Eric was looking for. Somebody that wanted to explore the universe and appreciate its beauty and its wonder. So it was Albert Einstein who, at least for a while, accompanied Eric as he moved along. You know, we always go back and ask a person's permission to tell their story in public, and we did that with Eric. But even that's a long while ago now. I don't know what he's gone on to do. I just know that he was ready to rock and roll. He was not wondering what he would do and frustrated by how to find a path forward any longer. He was he wanted to explore the universe, and he was a guy on the go. He wasn't Eric alone with his thoughts anymore. He was Eric, accompanied at least by Albert Einstein and God knows who after that, on his way to grand adventures. So I've only gotten to know Eric in the way that I'm sharing with you and that I share in the first of the two Afterlife Interrupted books. But I look forward to knowing him later in the Great Roundup. He's somebody that I can feel his presence with me now, and I just have a great deal of admiration for that young man. Anyway, that is it for this version of the Joyful Friar podcast. This is part 2 of a trilogy for Eric, Alone with His Thoughts, Compassionate Response. So if there's something that I can do for you, you can always contact me through my website, nathan-castle.com. But for now, God bless you, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time. God bless.